Hello everyone, my name is Ian McNaught. I'm the Strategic Organisational Development Manager at the Scotland Excel Academy. So in this video is a follow-up to the Stay Connected online workshops, and this topic is about introduction to leadership. So to kick us off, let's think about the difference between management and leadership, or the leadership and management continuum. So I've given a couple of definitions from the CIPD. And a couple of things to emphasise is management is the planning, the organisation, the coordination, implementation of a number of things, the strategies, the programmes, the tactics. This is all in respect of the people that we're managing, the resources that we have available, the operations that we run or we manage, and obviously there's aspects of finance and other components in there. So in summary, management is about the coordination, the implementation, the successful delivery of all of that. Different to that is leadership, which is actually the ability to influence people. So by the leader's attributes, by the behaviours, by acting as a role model, by constructively and proactively influencing. So that's quite different from management. In modern practice, we expect an individual to be able to straddle both management and leadership, but there is a clear distinction between the two. Very importantly though, leadership isn't just about the person with the formal title. It isn't simply about the hierarchy in the organisation. Modern practice says that we all have a part to play in leadership and management. So we should think about informal leadership. We should think about both formal and informal power. So if you influence someone, if you can constructively and positively influence someone to change their opinion, to create the opportunity where people adapt to a situation, their behaviours, how they actually do their work, then that's leadership. And that's something that we need to embrace as we go forward. And in this short video, we'll touch on a couple of reasons of why. There's a table here which actually just gives a summary or a comparison between two. So when we're thinking about management, it's about producing order and consistency. It's certainly about planning and budgeting. It's about organising the resources, the staff, the tasks, problem solving for sure, but it's the implementation of that too. We are measuring how we're performing, we're measuring how things are running, and we're taking the appropriate corrective action. And therefore, management is obviously very important. Leadership is different, as we've said before, though. It is about producing change. It is about creating an influence. It's about creating that vision, having a holistic view of everything that's visible to the individuals and the organisation. Now, there may be things that are going to happen we didn't foresee, that the leader didn't foresee, and that's real life. But leadership is about creating that vision, aligning the people through inspirational communication where people basically get it. They understand what the vision is. They understand where the organisation wants to head to. Management will implement a strategy and an operating plan which allows the people and the organisation to get there. So coming back to leadership then, it's about the inspirational communication. It's about the intellectual stimulation where people buy into that whole vision. And it's also about thinking about the whole organisation collectively and holistically, but it's very much about considering the individual to ensure that people's needs are understood and are met. And it's also about the leader being able to engage individuals in that group of people in that constructive management of difference to actually go forward. So leadership is very much about people. It's all about people, and therefore we should think about how we understand the people. Now, there's a couple of things in this actual graphic that may help us do that. And different people have got different views of these types of tools, so there's no judgment here. And if one tool doesn't work for you, or one technique doesn't work, then we should find one that does. But Myers-Briggs might help, where we consider the 16 personality traits. And it's not about pigeonholing people, and nothing is right or wrong here. You know, we're all different. And that could be because of our behaviours, which could be driven by our values, could be driven by our perceptions. So Myers-Briggs is a tool that might help us understand the people better. And if it does, we would adapt how we interact with certain people based upon how we perceive or think we understand the values of those people and why they act. And if we get it wrong, we have to reflect on that, think about another iteration, and look to better understand those people so we can more effectively work together. So Myers-Briggs is one tool. Insights discovery is probably now the most common one, which takes Myers-Briggs, the same psychology, but it builds on it, and it takes 16 personality traits to a wheel of 72 different types of personalities. There's a strong overlap between the two, but one's quite a bit more detailed. And then DISC is another technique which could help us, where we think about whether people are task-oriented or people-oriented, whether their personality trait is outgoing, whether they're reserved. So there's quite an overlap between these three tools, and I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm simply saying these might help us understand the people. Whether that's how we align people to a course of action, to a strategy, to an operating plan, how we motivate and inspire and build trust and make sure we support people in the appropriate way. Different people need different things. And in this content, there's some links. Obviously, I've given you the slide here. So there's some videos, which, you know, a couple of minutes, 3-4 minutes, it really gives you a good insight into that. So these tools might be worth using to understand the people, bearing in mind we all have a primary personality trait and a secondary trait, and that's fluid. There's a continuum that we will flex over, we will move along depending on the situations we find ourselves in, and maybe even how we're being treated or how we perceive we're being treated. So none of this is static, which perhaps makes it all the more important. If we understand the people, we've got a better chance of leading them. We've got a better chance of managing what we have to do and achieve together. Trust is very important. So introducing two different parts here. One is the transformational leadership, which is very different from transactional leadership. And then the very important and strong trust component of it. I haven't got it in the content here, but there's Patrick Lencioni's model considers what's called 5 dysfunctions or 5 dynamics of team behaviour, and trust is highlighted very strongly as the most important one. So how do we build trust and how do we sustain trust? And if we're going to lead, how do we lead in a transformational way? So there's a 5-component model here which starts with vision. Does a transformational leader communicate the vision in the appropriate way? Is it inspirational communication where people actually relate to what's being said and they buy into that? You know, everyone won't agree, but can they see the rationale? Can they understand why the leader and the organisation is intending to take that course of action? And does the communication underpin all of that? So as a leader communicates a message, the audience is thinking about that message, and we're applying what we already know to the message we hear, and we are creating new information from that. And if our experiences and perceptions and values are different, we most probably will interpret a different meaning, or we can interpret a different meaning. So that inspirational communication is pretty important in the clarity of communication. Similarly, as the leader is communicating that and through the leader's behaviours, does it stimulate people intellectually to think, I can do that or I can't do that, so I'll need some help? And does that supportive leadership provide that help? Or is it a case that people are very motivated to say, I want to do that, I can see the value in that? It may be the very opposite of that, where there's actually some pushback and there's some kickback about someone not wanting to go there because they don't value that. And therefore that leadership having an adaptive influence becomes really important. And last but not least, the people who are doing the work, do they get recognised for that work? Do they get recognised for their contribution? Whatever that recognition is will depend on your organisation and what's possible. It could be salary, it could be bonus. Okay, in the public sector it's not, but it could be the opportunity to do different things that you would value. And therefore that comes back to getting to know the people so we can take the appropriate course of action that we can actually support. In this slide, we should think about situational leadership, or it's sometimes called adaptive leadership. So there are many leadership models, and I've only listed 6 here. I'll come back to situational leadership last, but briefly we'll talk about there are obviously a number of others, whether it's Lewin's, which is quite straightforward, whether it's action-centred, where it's very much based on data analysis informing what we do. Transactional leadership is our more routine operational activities in that style of leadership. It's management by exception. It's a valid and appropriate approach, but it's not transformational. And clearly then there's a transformational leadership. We should think about leadership continuum. This is a situation where through the leader's insight, influence, behaviours and expertise, we should think about everything that we can see around us. That definitely includes the people. It would include our strategy, our operating plan. It would include our stakeholders. We're trying to think very holistically. Every external influence we are aware of or can see. And we should recognise that usually is changing quite a lot. Whether it's constantly evolving, or it's cyclical, or it's got some seasonality, it's not static. And our people are not static either. People have good days at work and bad days at work. People have good moods and bad moods. I might do something that really challenges someone's values, and that may be a constructive challenge where people support, buy in, and are motivated by that, or it might not be that. It might be people do not agree. So therefore, that situational leadership needs to adapt. So it needs to adapt along the curve that's shown there. We need to think about how we support people, how we direct people. So for directing, we're defining roles and tasks. There's some quite close supervision. Decisions are being made, but it's a one-way communication style. So it's a form of leadership. In a coaching environment, though, we're still defining roles and tasks, but it's a much more interactive two-way dialogue. So we encourage people's participation, people's views. Hopefully we get to a position which is greater than some of its parts, because there's been that interaction, that constructive management, a difference that says, okay, well, 2 and 2 doesn't make 4, it makes 5 if we look at it in that way, and we've got greater insight in what we're doing through that interaction. Sometimes it's more supporting, where there's a decision made, it's to be implemented, it might be delegated. So there's routine decisions that are communicated and need to happen. So that might be the leader simply facilitating that, communicating it. There's a bit of support there, but it's not autocratic and it's not directive. So we're not trying to control that situation. We're still trying to support people and hopefully empower people. The support could be long-term or short-term. It's a judgment by the people who are involved, you know, the formal leader, the informal leader, and all the team members. Delegation is that little bit different again. So I don't know if you buy into the term followers, or it's workers, or it's team members. It's just people. But in delegation, though, the leader needs to think about the level of involvement in making decisions and in problem solving. And that might also depend on the people who are there, the situation. Is it a crisis situation? Is there time to scope things out and explore? Is there an urgent need to actually deliver the service, solve the problems, create the value? So there's a bit of latitude in that delegation as well. But in summary, situational leadership or adaptive leadership should be moving along these components, and they're not necessarily discrete components. There's clearly some overlap there, and one merges into the other. So there's a judgment call by the leader, both the formal leader and the informal leader. We should think about tame, wicked and critical, and definitely we should think about wicked, and we'll come on to that, I think, in the next slide. The rationale of tame, wicked and crisis is maybe best thought of with tame problems. There is always a solution, normally a management solution. So we use appropriate processes, policies, procedures, standard operating procedures that have been created most probably for some time. And if we apply these in the appropriate way with some competence, then we'll solve the problem and we'll get a positive outcome. So it's relatively straightforward. I'm going to go to critical next and come back to wicked. In critical problems, there's a crisis. We know what the problem is. The building's on fire. We have to evacuate, let's get out. There isn't time, and it's not appropriate to discuss, explore and decide what course of action we think we should take. It's an authoritative command. Leadership takes control, perhaps you might consider autocratically, makes a decision, implements it and gets the job done. There is almost no uncertainty in this. And there is at times a place for tame and for critical. We might not like some of these approaches, but there is an appropriate time for that. If we think about wicked problems though, and it becomes important in the public sector, the leader's role is actually to ask the right questions from a group of people. Is that followers, team members, workers, short working group, whatever? But it's simply asking the right questions to work in collaboration. With wicked problems, we don't know the answer. We don't actually know if there is a solution at this point, and it's a much longer term approach. So we have to work collaboratively. We have to work with support both up and down the organisation, because this is going to take time to fix and it's going to be difficult. So the leader facilitates that interaction, that constructive management of difference, and empowers the people. We are looking for creative solutions here, things that may not have been done before. So we're exploring what's possible, and we're sharing that responsibility across the team, across the working group. What's really important in wicked problems is they're very complex, and we might not have an understanding or clear understanding of cause and effect. We can observe a situation is happening, but we don't know why. That becomes a bit more difficult though to act, because we might not know what course of action to take. But we do need to act because we need to solve the problem or minimise the problem, make it better. I'm staying on wicked problems for the moment, and if you think about our national environment, our national community of 32 local authorities distributed across the country, there's a lot of people employed here. Scottish Government has said there's 245,000 people employed in our local government sector, and there's another almost 82,000 people operating in this sector in third sector organisations. So we have hundreds of thousands of people with significant expertise and experience and knowledge. But we've got a growing number of wicked problems in the public sector, and some of them are decades old. And they're decades old because they're pretty difficult to fix or to minimise or to improve. The other part about wicked problems is we don't always know the outcomes, and we might solve or improve what we can see in front of us, what the problem is, but there could be consequences that we didn't see. So we might solve one problem and uncover a much larger problem. And that's the nature of wicked problems. And from that point of view, politically, they're really difficult, because people might perceive that there are no solutions. We've tried that before. In fact, we've been working on this for 20 years, and at this point we've invested X billions of pounds into it, and it's still not solved. Well, the solution we come up with might be unpalatable. It's not acceptable to elected members and decision makers. Or our recommended and proposed course of action might simply be too expensive. So there are significant challenges in the complexity of wicked problems, but therefore we need good leadership to find a way forward here. Working collaboratively, constructively managing differences of views, opinions, and hopefully getting 32 local authorities to work together. There's definitely some commonality here, and if we could co-act, work together, co-creating, co-producing, we have got a massive resource pool and expertise across the country. But there's no immediate or ultimate test of a wicked problem, and therefore that's the point about we might fix something and there's future repercussions which might be worse than what we've just fixed, and that politically could be pretty challenging. Audit Scotland have said in the public sector it's an environment which is complex, it's changing and it's uncertain. We know we worked through 10 years of austerity. Nevertheless, there's £10 billion invested in the public sector. It's a massive budget, but it's got a lot to do. But it's had real term fund reductions, year on year for many years. And then we've got the current COVID-19 pandemic, which is clearly a wicked problem and a very difficult problem. But for all these reasons, leadership is very, very important. Leadership is crucial. And we often talk about culture, or culture is often talked about quite a lot, and it's either introduced as the saviour to everything, or it's introduced as it's a major problem. And I'm using a quote here from Simon Sinek, who says it's too easy to talk about culture as being different. It's too easy to talk about culture as being the problem. But because culture is not actionable, we can't really do anything about culture if we talk about it like that. It's certainly highly complex, and it can be very difficult to change. And if we get it right, it can be hugely significant and beneficial. So we should think about not culture itself, but some of its component parts. People's attitudes, and we talked a little bit about that earlier with the personality traits. People's behaviours. Are people's behaviours progressive, supportive, detrimental, challenging? Why? Well, maybe that comes back to attitudes, maybe that comes to motivation, all things that leaders should be thinking about and understanding and actually improving and very, very much facilitating improvement and all of that. What about people's abilities, their motivations? What about their perceptions? What about their work practices? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they progressive? Do we know? Does the leader have that holistic view of all of that? Because that's part of transformational leadership, that's part of situational leadership. And also to know what we don't know. We don't understand why that's happening. We need to go and explore and investigate that. The leader has the authority and the power to make some things happen there. If we think about the vision, the mission, the strategy, and the operating plan approach, that straddles leadership and management. So the leader or leaders should create the vision, what the organisation wants to become, where it wants to get to, the missions or purpose, and then more from a managerial aspect, there's normally a strategy. So the strategy is simply a planned series of actions, and it's underpinned by the operating plan, the tactics with which we're going to achieve the strategy. And the operating plan is normally divided amongst departments, functions, teams, and people. So we know what our objectives are, we know what resources we have, what budget we have, what timeline we have to achieve all of that. That interaction of vision, mission, strategy, and operating plan is really, really very, very important. And it is interconnected, and it straddles the leadership and management continuum. So very relevant to what we're talking about. Now, the next kind of list of bullets, I'm not going to get into in a lot of detail, but this maybe actually leads us into a future workshop about transformational leadership or strategic leadership. But the people we are working with, the people who are carrying out the work, the people who we are looking to develop, manage and lead, have to be able to relate to all of this. So self-determination theory is the autonomy, competence and relatedness. Do people have the autonomy to do the job we're asking them to do? Do they have the competence to do the job? Competence is not exactly the same as ability, it's actually different, but they're strongly related. People might not perceive they have the competence, although they have the ability. So that's something the leader needs to, again, get to know the people and support them in the appropriate way. If people can't relate to the vision, I'm going to miss out mission just now, but the vision, the strategy and the operating plan, then they won't buy in. But worse than not buying in, they might actually kick back and be quite detrimental in their behaviours. And that might give the organisation and or the leader a problem or problems. So without making it sound too kind of psychological theory, this is really quite important. Now, sometimes we do this intuitively, and that's great. Other times we have to think about it, reflect on it, and try and understand things. Whatever works for the leader is the important thing. If we can do it intuitively and do it, mentally, brilliant. And if not, we should give it some proper time to think about. But this self-determination through these components is relevant to every person. So it takes time to think about and reflect on, and it's complex because if you've got 50 people in your team, you've got this to think about 50 times if we're actually going to practice good leadership. Exploitation and exploration is something we should think about. We normally are thinking about we exploit. We apply what we know within the standard processes and policies, and we achieve some value, whatever that means. Delivering a service, solving problems, saving money, avoiding money, being more productive, all of that. Exploration is completely different from exploitation, where we go and explore. It's a bit experimental. We know we have a problem or an opportunity, and we go and scope out how we might approach that, or how we might solve a problem, create some value, or whatever it is we're trying to achieve. Exploration is much more risky than exploitation. It might fail. Some of it will fail, and there might be some perceptions around that potential failure because we've spent time and money on it. But if we're going to solve wicked problems, we have to be able to explore. So leaders need to create an environment where there's an appetite within the people and within the organisation to explore. Briefly, interpretation and perception. We're all people with different skills and expertise and values, and we most probably will have differences in how we interpret situations and how we perceive them. But as an individual does that, we believe it. If I perceive something, if I interpret something that way, I believe it. I may be wrong, you might be right, but unless we have that conversation and one person can actually influence the other, then we're going to be working with different approaches to the same problem, or not fully buying in, or perhaps kicking back. So to sum up some of that, it's then about that constructive management of differences, and we all have them. But the constructive management of differences is finding enough commonality to sustain sufficient momentum to move forward. We will not ever all agree, and that's okay. If we have that type of, I'm going to use the word culture, that cultural environment where our attitudes and behaviours and motivation can take some steps forward. And all of that is underpinned with trust and with transformational leadership. Okay, just checking time. I'm going to kick off by saying I absolutely understand in the current crisis situation in the COVID-19 pandemic, it's extremely tough, and some people are losing their livelihoods, some people are dying, and I absolutely respect that and acknowledge that's a bad situation, and I'm being respectful of that. But I want to use this graphic to actually think about something. So this was from CMI and LinkedIn, where it's but a number of people have said this through the years. Basically, don't waste a crisis, or some people have said don't waste a good crisis, and that's not meant disrespectfully. What's meant by that is, in a crisis situation, there is often a situation where we can do things that we couldn't do before, either because we're more motivated to do it, or it's essential that we do it, or the things that were preventing us moving forward with how we would have liked to have done something is now minimised because it's a critical situation and we have to find the solution. So from that point of view, a crisis can actually be an opportunity to do things in new ways, to implement things that we haven't been able to try before, to explore where it's not been possible before because it's been about exploitation. The budget wasn't approved, or the resources weren't approved, and maybe that was the right decision then, but now the situation we find ourselves in, we must act. So we should bear that in mind with a crisis, whether that means we can be more creative, more exploratory, or we can get some things done in ways that just were not acceptable before. It's all of that. Okay, I'm just giving you a graphic here of the actual Scotland Excel Academy. So there's quite a lot of information in the public domain where you don't have to be registered in any workshops or programmes. So that's there should you want to use it. We would certainly welcome your use of that. And since we're talking about leadership, I'm just highlighting two potential opportunities. The Academy delivers a leadership practice unit at HND level as part of a diploma in management leadership. And we also deliver a strategic management leadership unit in the master's level programme. So if they were of interest, I would be more than happy to talk to you about those. And I've given you the Academy URL at the very top. Sharing my contact details. If you've got questions or opinions or anything you'd like to discuss about leadership, I would be more than happy to engage with you on that. So leaving the details here and hope to hear from you. In addition to that, this is not all my work. I'm just giving you the references of any literature that I've used. Should you be interested in pursuing that or verifying any of it or learning more about it. So there's a couple of pages of references there. Thank you very much for your time. Take care.